Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is the second episode of the Arachnology series. Today I'm going to be focusing on scorpions. So as we can already infer from the previous video, scorpions are arachnids, which means that their bodies are divided into two segments, they have 8 legs, and they have pedipalps. So we know all that already right out the gate. And of course their mouthparts are chelicerae. So what differentiates scorpions from other arachnids? The most obvious answer to that would be the tail. The tail is kind of a characteristic that you're not going to see elsewhere. But let's focus on the main body first, though. Just like all the other arachnids, they have a cephalothorax. The difference is that their cephalothorax is longer, it's a little more rectangular, and it appears to be fused more symmetrically to the abdomen. And they also have an abdomen, which is also quite long. And so it almost looks like they have one single segment to their body. But if you look closely enough, you can see where the separation between the cephalothorax and the abdomen begins. So that's the two main body parts. But then at the very, very, very distal end of the abdomen, you start seeing these additional segments form. And it makes perfect sense when you look at the way these segments are shaped, that they are just an extension of the abdomen. But they just keep going up and up and up, and finally they terminate in a sting at the very end, and so that's that trademark scorpion's tail. And again, I know I said it before, but it bears repeating, you do not see this in any other arachnids. There are arachnids with tail-like structures, but you do not see a stinging tail on anything else. It's why even the silhouette of a scorpion is recognizable to a person. Just the overall shape that they have, it's very unique. It's not something you really see anywhere else. There's actually a term called cancrification, where a lot of animals that are not crabs take the shape of a crab. It's a very useful shape in nature, especially if you are an arthropod. If you have segments, nature, a lot of the pressures, a lot of the evolutionary pressures in different biomes are going to translate to, well, it would be useful to have pincers, it would be useful to have a certain amount of legs, it would be useful to have a very hard, very rounded carapace. And so a lot of animals that aren't crabs look like crabs. Scorpions kind of, sort of, in a roundabout way, look like crabs. And the reason why, it's nothing to do with their body shape, and it's certainly nothing to do with their tail. It has everything to do with their pincers. Well, a lot of people think those pincers are legs. They're actually not. That is the translation for pedipalps in scorpions. All arachnids have pedipalps, and they vary dramatically. In spiders, as we previously mentioned, they're more of a sensory organ. For scorpions, they are a means of both grabbing prey and defending themselves against would-be predators. And there's a fun little, it's not perfect, but there's a fun little way that you can sort of determine, softball science here, the venom content of a scorpion, whether or not it would be particularly harmful for a person, in other words. And that's the ratio, and this is again soft science, it's just based on what you're looking at. If you look at the pincers, and they're very, 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 very big, and the tail is relatively small by comparison, that's an animal that relies on those pincers, on those pedipalps that have been modified, for both defense and offense. And as a result, they almost certainly don't have very strong venom. On the flip side, if you see a scorpion that has, hang on, I gotta pause this because I'm about to cough a lot, and there's no way of putting it in the vid. There we go. Anyway, on the flip side, if you see little tiny pincers and a big tail, that's an animal whose primary defense and offense is the venom in that tail, and that one's going to be much more harmful to humans, possibly even medically significant, if not life-threatening. So that's just a fun way of determining. You know, when I was a kid, there was this urban legend that the emperor scorpion was the most deadly in the world. And what's funny about that is if you look at an emperor scorpion, it has massive lobster-looking claws and then a teeny tiny tail, and that's because their venom is like a flippin' honeybee. It's not significant in the slightest. On the flip side, Hottentotta, big tail, tiny pincers, really going to mess you up if you get stung. One thing that scorpions also have that there is no equivalent to are pectines. And most people, again, if you're watching this video, there's a very good chance you've never seen or heard of pectines. And they're actually kind of interesting. There's no equivalent, and it's not something you're just ordinarily going to notice about scorpions because it's on their underside, and very rarely do we get a look at the undercarriage of a scorpion. There are these weird-looking, they almost look like gills. It's a peculiar V shape with these little hairs on the end, and it's a sensory organ. It scrapes the ground, and it has chemoreceptors, so it does what we do when we smell things, in other words. It picks up on all these chemical cues. It picks up on textural cues on the ground. It's a really unique and unusual organ. And you can also, and this is again more of a softball science thing, it's very difficult to sex scorpions. But one of the ways that people do softball-wise, when I say softball, I mean it's not perfect, in other words, is looking at the pectines. The males generally have much larger, more feathery-looking pectines, which kind of makes sense in the context of, like with moths, the feathery antennae on moths are the plumate are males, and the club-like are females. Well, that's because the males use those plumate antennae to find the pheromones of females. Well, in scorpions, that's how they find females, is using those pectines, picking up on chemical cues that the females leave behind. And speaking of scorpions and reproduction, they are very unusual in another way. That has to do with the reproduction. Many scorpions are parthenogenic. Parthenous means virgin, and genic means creation. Female scorpions, many different species of them, can just get pregnant without mating. And this happens in other invertebrates, but what's really unusual about this is these are not clones. I'm actually not sure procedurally how this happens, but the females can produce all manner of offspring that are genetically distinct from her. Now, obviously, the way she's doing this is she's rearranging her own genome. So it's not like she's producing genetic material out of nothing. The real issue is the methods in which it varies and how that translates to producing male offspring. But this is something that they absolutely do, and it's not the least bit uncommon for owners of scorpions in captivity to be astonished to find that the female that they had raised from a baby who had never had any interaction with a male scorpion is just all of a sudden pregnant. Another interesting thing about scorpions and their reproduction is it's usually oviviparous, which means that eggs do exist, but they exist internally, and then they hatch internally, and then the female gives birth to live young. Afterwards, they, being white and soft and just completely vulnerable, they climb on her back. They are on her back until their first or second molt, and then they go their separate ways. So you do see some degree of maternal care in scorpions that is mostly absent in other arachnids. Not completely. There's plenty of instances of maternal care in other arachnids, but the scorpions, it's kind of across the board. You don't really see instances of scorpions being born and immediately leaving upon hatching, namely because they don't hatch. So yeah, interesting stuff. And now to get back on point about those chelicerae, because that's what arachnids are sort of all about, scorpion chelicerae are very different from spider chelicerae. They are absolutely chewing mouth parts. They're actually kind of freaky. They remind me of the Dark Crystal movie, those beetle things. The way their mouth parts were just sort of like pincers that kind of ripped and teared. That's how a scorpion's mouth part works. You've got the chelicerae, the big tube-like muscle, and then it terminates in what's kind of very similar to actually their pincer pedipalps, except there's just a lot of them. And just if you look at a scorpion's face, there is just a lot going on. Like you've got those little eyes, which is sort of relatable, but then if you look at the mouth, it is nothing like any other animal's mouth parts. It is utterly alien. All those little pincer parts, very similar to Opiliones too, which we will also be covering later. So, yeah, that about actually covers it for scorpions. That distinguishes them from all the other arachnids. So, like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.